was fantastic.
Ready?
Ready.
Let's begin.
I think that's the final note. Bravo, absolutely wonderful.
She was a quiet girl who rarely spoke more than a few words in a day. People in her small neighborhood often saw her walking alone with her head slightly lowered, as if she was trying not to take up space in the world. She lived a simple life where every day was about responsibilities, small struggles, and silent dreams that no one else really understood. To most people around her, she was just another face in the crowd, someone who blended into the background of busy streets and ordinary routines. But inside her, there was something very different. There was a world that no one could see, a world filled with sound, rhythm, emotion, and imagination. And at the center of that world was music. She had first discovered the piano when she was still very young. It was not a fancy instrument in her life. It belonged to an old community hall that was rarely used. One afternoon, she had wandered inside that hall while seeking shelter from heavy rain. The building was empty, except for dust-covered chairs and a single worn-out piano placed near the corner. The moment she saw it, something inside her changed, even though she did not understand it at the time. She slowly walked toward it, curious but careful, as if she was afraid the piano might break under her touch. When she pressed her first key, the sound that came out was slightly out of tune. It was not perfect at all, but to her it felt like magic. That single sound stayed in her mind long after she left the hall that day. It followed her home, stayed in her thoughts at night, and echoed in her dreams. From that moment, she started visiting the hall whenever she could. She had no teacher, no guidance, and no proper training. Everything she learned came from observation, memory, and feeling. She would listen carefully to sounds in her environment and try to recreate them on the old piano. Sometimes she would spend hours pressing the same few keys, trying to understand how emotion could turn into music. Life outside that hall was not easy for her. She had responsibilities that demanded her attention. She often helped at small jobs just to support her daily needs. There were days when she felt tired, hungry, and discouraged. But even on those days, the thought of the piano gave her a strange kind of strength. It was the only place where she felt like she truly existed. As time passed, her connection with music grew deeper. She did not know how to read complex musical notes, but she could feel patterns in her mind. She could sense when a sound felt incomplete and when it felt whole. Her style was not learned from books or schools. It was shaped by emotions, by sadness, hope, loneliness, and quiet dreams that she never shared with anyone. But the world around her remained unaware of this hidden side of her life. To others, she was still just a silent girl who kept to herself. No one knew that she spent her evenings sitting in an empty hall, creating melodies that came directly from her heart. One day, while working at a small local place to earn a little money, she overheard people talking about a famous pianist who was going to visit the city. His name was known across many places. People said he was not only highly skilled but also extremely strict when it came to music. He believed that true talent was rare, and he often dismissed those he thought were not serious enough. There was going to be a small session where a few selected individuals could perform in front of him. Most people treated it like something impossible to reach, something meant only for trained musicians from respected backgrounds. But when she heard about it, something inside her quietly stirred. She did not think she was good enough. She did not think she would be accepted. But for the first time in her life, she felt a small but powerful urge to step out of her hidden world. She wanted to know what it would feel like to play in front of someone who truly understood music at the highest level. Even if she was rejected, she wanted to experience that moment. For several days, she hesitated. She would think about it while working, while walking home, and while sitting alone near her old piano. Doubt kept pulling her back. She knew she did not have proper training. She knew she did not belong in such an environment. But something deeper inside her kept pushing her forward. Finally, one early morning, she made her decision. She would go. The day of the session arrived with a strange heaviness in the air. She dressed simply, as she always did, and made her way toward the venue. Her steps were slow at first, but as she got closer, they became more steady. She kept telling herself that she was only going to try, nothing more. The venue was much larger and more intimidating than she had imagined. There were polished floors, elegant decorations, and people who looked confident and experienced. Many of them carried themselves with pride, as if they already belonged there. She suddenly felt out of place, like she had entered a world that was never meant for her. When her name, or rather her turn, was called, she walked forward with a quiet breath. Her hands were slightly trembling, but she tried to hide it. She sat in front of the piano placed in the center of the room. The lights above made everything feel even more intense. Before she could even fully prepare herself, she noticed the famous pianist sitting among the judges. His expression was calm but serious. He observed her with a quick glance, taking in her appearance and posture. There was no warmth in his eyes, only evaluation. She began to speak softly, trying to introduce herself, but she was interrupted almost immediately. One of the assistants exchanged a look with the others, and there was a brief discussion she could not hear clearly. The atmosphere felt cold and distant. Then came the words that changed everything in that moment. She was told, in a polite but firm tone, that she would not be required to perform. They implied that the level of the session required more prepared individuals, and that she might not be suitable for it. For a moment, she could not move. It was not loud rejection. It was quiet, controlled, and polite, but it still felt heavy. She slowly stood up, bowed slightly without saying anything, and walked away. No one stopped her. No one called her back. As she stepped out of the venue, the outside air felt colder than before. She walked without knowing exactly where she was going. Her heart felt heavy, but she did not cry. Not yet. Something inside her was silent, as if trying to understand what had just happened. She reached a quiet part of the city and sat down for a while. Her thoughts were tangled. A part of her wanted to give up completely. She wondered if she had been foolish to even try. But another part of her, deeper and stronger, refused to accept that this was the end. Without realizing it, her feet began to move again. She found herself walking toward the only place that had ever truly listened to her, the old abandoned hall with the piano. When she reached it, the door was slightly open, just as she had left it many times before. Dust floated in the light coming through broken windows. The room was silent, waiting. She sat down in front of the piano. This time, she did not think about rules or judges or rejection. She did not think about being accepted or ignored. She simply placed her fingers on the keys and let everything inside her come out. And in that moment, something began to change. She sat in front of the old piano in the empty hall, her fingers resting gently on the keys. The room was quiet, except for the soft sound of dust moving in the air whenever a small breeze entered through the broken window. It felt like the world had slowed down just for her, giving her a small space where no one could judge her, no one could interrupt her, and no one could tell her she did not belong. For a long moment, she did nothing. Her mind was still carrying the weight of what had happened earlier. The memory of being turned away from the session kept coming back, like a voice she could not silence. Even though it was not said in a harsh way, it still left a deep mark inside her. She kept thinking about how quickly she was dismissed, how easily she was judged without being heard. Her hands slowly tightened and loosened on the keys. She was not sure what she was about to play. There was no plan in her mind, no prepared melody, no structured notes, only feelings. And those feelings were heavy. She took a slow breath and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, slightly uneven, and uncertain. It echoed through the empty hall like a whisper. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she pressed another key, and another. Slowly, the sounds began to connect, not in perfect rhythm, but in a way that felt honest. At first, her playing was hesitant. It was like she was testing the piano, trying to find where she fit within it. But as seconds passed, something started to shift inside her. The hesitation did not disappear completely, but it began to turn into something else, something deeper. Her thoughts began to blend with the sound. The memory of rejection turned into a slow, heavy rhythm. The feeling of walking away in silence turned into soft, broken notes that lingered in the air. The confusion she felt outside the building became scattered patterns of sound that rose and fell without warning. She was not trying to impress anyone. There was no audience, no expectation, only expression. And that was when the music started to change. Her fingers moved more freely now. The keys were no longer just objects under her hands. They felt like a language she was slowly remembering. The sound grew stronger, then softer again, like waves moving back and forth. There was sadness in it, but also something else. A quiet determination that refused to disappear. She did not realize how much time was passing. The outside world no longer mattered. Even the empty hall around her felt less empty. It was as if the space was slowly filling with invisible emotions that could not be seen but could be felt. At one point she paused. Her hands hovered above the keys. She opened her eyes and looked around the hall. It was still the same broken, forgotten place. But in her mind it felt different now. It no longer felt like a place of loneliness. It felt like a place where she could speak without words. She placed her hands back on the piano. This time the music changed again. It became more structured, more confident. There was still emotion in it, but now there was direction. It was not just pain anymore. It was the process of turning pain into something meaningful. The notes moved with more clarity, as if she was building something piece by piece from her memories. She remembered small moments from her life without trying to. The long days of working quietly without recognition. The nights when she practiced alone while everyone else slept. The times she doubted herself but still returned to the piano because she had nothing else that made her feel alive. All of those memories slowly turned into sound. The piano no longer felt like an old, broken instrument. In her hands, it became something alive. Something that responded to her emotions. It was imperfect, yes, but that imperfection made it real. As she continued playing, something unexpected happened inside her. The weight she had been carrying for so long began to feel lighter. Not because the rejection no longer mattered, but because she was finally giving it a voice. She was no longer holding it inside. The melody shifted again. It became softer, almost gentle. There was a calmness now that had not been there before. It was like a quiet acceptance of everything she had gone through. Not surrender, but understanding. She realized that music was not just about perfection. It was about truth. And her truth was not perfect. It was broken at times, uncertain at times, but it was real. Her fingers slowed slightly, but the emotion did not fade. Instead, it deepened. Every note felt intentional now. Every pause had meaning. Even the silence between sounds carried weight. She did not know how long she had been playing, but by the time she reached the final part of her unplanned piece, her hands were steady. Her heart, which had felt heavy earlier, now felt strangely calm. She pressed the last key and let it ring out. The sound slowly faded into the empty hall. Then silence returned. She sat still for a moment, not moving. Her hands rested gently on her lap. She was breathing slowly, as if she had just returned from somewhere far away. Her eyes remained fixed on the piano in front of her. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel invisible. Even though no one had been there to listen, she felt heard. Not by others, but by herself. Outside, the world continued as usual. People passed by the hall without noticing what had just happened inside. The building remained forgotten, unchanged. But inside that space, something important had taken place. Something that did not need an audience to be real. She slowly stood up and looked around the hall once more. There was no applause, no recognition, no judgment, only silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was full. Full of everything she had just expressed. She gently touched the piano one last time, as if thanking it without words. Then she turned and walked toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, the sunlight felt different. It was not brighter, but it felt clearer somehow. The world had not changed, but something inside her had. She began walking home, not with certainty about the future, but with a quiet feeling she had never fully experienced before. It was not confidence yet. It was something smaller but important. A belief that her voice, even if unheard by others, still had meaning. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know that this moment inside the empty hall would one day lead to something far bigger than she could imagine. But for now, she carried one thing with her: the sound of her own truth, still echoing softly in her mind. The next morning came quietly, as if nothing special had happened the night before. The streets were the same, the people were the same, and the world continued its usual rhythm without noticing anything different. But for her, something inside had shifted. It was not loud or dramatic. It was small, steady, and hard to explain. She still woke up early, still prepared herself for the day, and still went about her responsibilities. But her mind was not completely where it used to be. The memory of the piano in the empty hall stayed with her. Not as a dream, but as something real she could still feel. She could still hear the way the sound had filled the silence. She could still feel the way her emotions had turned into music without her forcing them. It was strange for her, because she had never experienced something like that before. It was not about being praised or accepted. It was about being understood by herself. Still, she tried not to think too much about it. Life did not give her the freedom to stay lost in thoughts for long. There were tasks waiting, small jobs to complete, and responsibilities that required her attention. So she continued her routine, moving through the day with quiet focus. But even while working, her mind kept drifting back. She would pause for a moment, look at her hands, and remember how those same hands had once created something that felt so honest. She had no audience, no approval, no applause. Yet it had felt more real than anything she had ever done before. At one point during the day, she found herself standing near a small shop where an old radio was playing softly. The sound of music came out of it, something carefully composed and polished. It was beautiful, but it felt distant to her now. She listened for a few seconds, then slowly walked away. It was not that she disliked it. It was just that something inside her had changed in a way she could not fully describe. Later that afternoon, while returning home, she passed by a notice board near a community center. There were several papers pinned there, most of them announcing events, classes, and small local gatherings. She was about to walk past it without stopping, like she always did, but something made her pause. Her eyes landed on a small announcement about a musical session happening in the city. It mentioned a well-known pianist who would be attending a private selection process for new performers. The words were simple, but they caught her attention immediately. She stood still for a moment, reading it again. Slowly, the memory of what had happened before came back. The cold room, the silent judgment, the polite rejection. She remembered how quickly she had been dismissed without even being truly heard. A part of her wanted to turn away from the notice and forget it completely. She had already experienced that moment once. There was no reason to go through it again. But another part of her hesitated, because now something was different. She had played alone. She had felt something real in that empty hall. Even though no one else had been there, she knew what she had created came from a place she had never reached before. It was not about skill or training. It was about expression. And for the first time, she started to wonder something quietly inside her mind. What if that moment in the empty hall was not just something personal? What if it meant something more? She shook her head slightly, as if trying to push the thought away. Felt too big, too unrealistic. She was just a simple girl trying to get through life. People like her did not get noticed in places like that. Still, she did not walk away immediately. She stood there for a little longer, staring at the notice. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind, making the edges curl. Around her, people passed by without paying attention. For them, it was just another announcement. But for her, it felt like a door she was not sure whether to open. Finally, she turned and walked away. But the thought did not leave her. That night, she could not sleep easily. She lay quietly, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night outside. Everything was calm, but her mind was not. She kept going back and forth between doubt and curiosity. She reminded herself of the rejection. She reminded herself of how out of place she had felt in that polished hall. She told herself that nothing had changed, that she was still the same person, still without formal training, still without recognition. But then another thought kept interrupting those doubts. She remembered the music she had played alone. Not the memory of being ignored, but the sound itself. The way it had grown from confusion into something structured. The way it had carried emotion without needing explanation. It had felt real. And that was what made it difficult to ignore. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. She sat quietly for a while before starting her day. Her thoughts were still heavy, but there was a different kind of energy in them now. Not excitement, not confidence, but something more subtle. A kind of curiosity she could not silence. As she prepared to leave for work, she found herself walking slightly slower than usual. Her mind was not fully focused on her surroundings. It was still somewhere between doubt and possibility. During the day, she noticed small things more clearly than before. The rhythm of footsteps on the street. The way people spoke when they passed each other. Even the sounds of everyday life seemed more connected in her mind, as if she was hearing them differently. Music was starting to exist in everything again, but she did not tell anyone about it. She had never been someone who easily shared her thoughts, and this felt even more personal than anything before. By the time evening came, she found herself standing once again in front of the same community hall where the old piano was kept. She had not planned to come there. Her feet had simply taken her in that direction without her fully deciding. She stood outside for a while, looking at the door. The hall looked the same as before. Quiet, slightly worn, almost forgotten. There was no sign of change. But to her it felt different now. It no longer felt like just an abandoned place. It felt like a space where something important had happened. She slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar sight greeted her. The dust in the air, the quiet corners, and the old piano sitting patiently in its place. Everything was exactly as she had left it. She walked toward it slowly. Her fingers brushed lightly against the surface before she sat down. For a moment she did not play. She simply sat there, remembering. Then, without thinking too much, she placed her hands on the keys again. The first note was soft, almost uncertain, but it was enough to bring everything back. And just like before, the silence of the hall began to fill with sound. She sat at the old piano once again, her hands resting quietly on the keys. The hall around her was the same as before, silent and slightly dusty, with soft light coming through the broken window. Nothing had changed outside, but inside her, something already felt different the moment her fingers touched the instrument. This time, she did not hesitate as much. The first note came out soft, but it was steady. She did not rush it. She let it stay in the air for a moment before adding the next one. Slowly, the silence around her began to disappear, replaced by sound that felt more controlled than before. She was still not thinking about structure or technique. There were no rules in her mind. But there was something new growing inside her playing. A kind of awareness. As if she was beginning to understand the shape of her own emotions better than before. The memory of the rejection still existed, but it no longer felt like a sharp pain. It felt more like something distant. Something that had already happened and could no longer control her. Instead of breaking her focus, it was becoming part of her music in a quiet way. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The notes were not perfect, but they were connected. One sound led naturally into another. It was as if the piano was responding to her thoughts more clearly this time. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she did, the music changed slightly. It became deeper, more layered. The sound was no longer just about sadness or confusion. It started to carry something more balanced. There was still emotion, but it was shaped differently now. Like she was no longer just releasing feelings, but also organizing them into something meaningful. Time began to lose its importance. She did not know how long she had been playing. Minutes, maybe longer. The world outside the hall felt far away, almost unreachable. Inside that space, only the piano mattered. At one point, she paused for a second. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She opened her eyes and looked around the hall again. The same empty chairs, the same quiet corners, the same old walls that had seen very little attention for years. But something about the room felt warmer now. Not physically, but emotionally. As if the sound she had been creating was filling the space with something invisible. She took a slow breath and continued. This time, the music became stronger. It was no longer just personal expression. Started to feel like a story, a journey. The notes rose and fell with more purpose. Some parts were soft and gentle, while others carried a stronger, more determined rhythm. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was not thinking about any audience. But still, something inside her was pushing the music forward. It was as if the piano was helping her speak a language she had never fully learned before. Her hands moved more freely now. There was less doubt in her movements. Even when she made small mistakes, she did not stop. She simply continued, letting the flow of sound carry her forward. That was something new for her. Earlier, she would often stop when something did not feel right. She would hesitate, correct, and repeat. But now, she was allowing imperfections to exist within the music. She was beginning to understand that emotion did not always need perfection to be real. As she played, different memories came into her mind, not in a painful way, but in a flowing sequence. Small moments from her life appeared and disappeared like soft echoes. Times when she had felt invisible. Times when she had doubted herself. Times when she had wondered if her love for music was meaningless. All of it slowly transformed into sound. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was becoming a reflection of everything she had carried inside her for years. Her music shifted again. This time it became lighter. There was still depth, but now there was also a sense of movement forward. It was not stuck in the past anymore. It was beginning to move beyond it. She did not realize it immediately, but her breathing had changed. It was calmer now, more steady. Her shoulders were less tense. Her entire body was slowly adjusting to the rhythm she was creating. For the first time in a long while, she was not carrying the weight of expectations or judgment. She was simply existing inside the sound. At one point, she pressed a series of notes that felt different from the rest. They were not planned. They just came naturally. But those notes created a shift in the atmosphere of the music. Felt like a turning point. The melody became clearer, more defined. It still had emotion, but now it also had direction. Like a path being formed step by step. She did not question it. She followed it. Her fingers moved with a quiet confidence she did not fully recognize in herself yet. It was not loud confidence. It was something softer. A belief that whatever was coming out of her was enough. Outside the hall, the world continued as usual. People passed by without noticing anything. The building remained unnoticed, just another forgotten place among many. But inside, something meaningful was unfolding. She reached a part of the music where everything seemed to slow down. The notes became more spaced, more thoughtful. There was a sense of reflection in them now. Felt like she was looking at her own journey through sound. She thought about the moment she first touched a piano. The uncertainty, the curiosity, the way a simple sound had stayed with her longer than expected. She thought about the rejection again, but without bitterness this time. It was still there, but it no longer defined her. And she thought about the feeling she had when she played alone in this very hall before. The feeling of being truly honest with herself for the first time. All of these thoughts blended into the music. Her playing slowed slightly, but it did not lose strength. Instead, it became more expressive. Every note seemed to carry intention. There was no rush anymore, only flow. At one point, she stopped pressing the keys for a brief moment. The last sound she played continued to echo in the hall. She listened to it carefully as it faded. Then she smiled slightly. It was not a big smile. Just a small, quiet expression of understanding. She placed her hands back on the piano and played again. This time, the music did not feel like struggle or discovery. It felt like acceptance. She kept playing the piano in the empty hall, and this time something felt very different inside her. It was not confusion anymore. It was not hesitation. It was a steady feeling, like she had finally stopped searching for permission to exist in her own music. Her fingers moved with a calm rhythm, pressing each key with a kind of trust she had never felt before. The sound filled the hall in waves, gentle at times and stronger at others, like a conversation between her thoughts and the instrument. There was no audience, no judgment, and no pressure to perform perfectly. And somehow that made everything more real. She did not know it yet, but this moment would become something that changed everything. Outside, the world carried on as usual. People walked past the old building without noticing anything special. The hall remained hidden in its forgotten corner of the city, carrying its usual silence. But inside, something powerful was growing quietly through the sound of her music. As she played, her mind no longer felt heavy. The rejection she had experienced earlier did not feel like a sharp wound anymore. It felt more like a distant memory, something that had shaped her but no longer controlled her. Instead of breaking her, it had pushed her toward something deeper. Her music began to shift again. It was no longer just emotional expression. It started to form structure on its own, as if her feelings were naturally arranging themselves into patterns. Some parts were soft and slow, almost like a quiet reflection. Other parts were stronger, carrying a sense of quiet strength that surprised even her. She had never learned music in a formal way, yet what she was creating felt complete in its own way. Not perfect, but honest. And that honesty gave it a strange kind of beauty. She closed her eyes again. When she did, the sound became even more layered. It was as if the piano was not just an instrument anymore, but a partner responding to her emotions. Every key she pressed felt connected to something inside her that had been waiting a long time to be heard. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The hall disappeared in her mind. The broken walls, the dusty corners, even the silence between the notes faded away. All that remained was the flow of sound and feeling moving together. She thought she was alone, and in a way she was. But the music she was creating carried something that felt larger than the space she was in. It carried everything she had ever felt but never expressed. There were moments in the music that sounded uncertain, almost like questions. Then those moments slowly turned into answers. Not answers from outside, but answers from within herself. She did not realize how long she had been playing. Time was no longer something she was aware of. Minutes and hours lost meaning. Only the music remained. At one point, her fingers slowed down. The melody softened, becoming almost like a whisper. It felt like the music itself was breathing, resting for a moment before continuing. She opened her eyes briefly and looked at the piano. The same old keys, slightly worn, slightly uneven. But in her hands, they no longer felt limited. They felt alive. She smiled faintly again, not because something was funny, but because something inside her finally felt understood. She continued playing. The music began to rise again, but not in a rushed way. It grew naturally, like a story unfolding step by step. There was a sense of movement in it now, a direction that had not been there before. It felt like she was no longer stuck in one place emotionally. Something inside her had started to move forward, even if she could not fully explain what that meant. Her thoughts no longer interrupted her playing. Instead, they blended into it. Memories of struggle, small disappointments, silent days of working without recognition, and moments of doubt all appeared and transformed into sound. Nothing stayed painful for long. Everything turned into something meaningful through the music. She did not try to control it. She simply followed it. At one point, she pressed a series of notes that felt different. They were unexpected, but they fit perfectly into the flow. It was like discovering a new path while walking without a map. That moment changed the direction of the piece she was creating. The music became brighter, not in a loud or cheerful way, but in a way that felt open, like a door slowly being unlocked after being closed for a long time. She had never planned this. She had never practiced this, but it was happening naturally, as if it had always been inside her, waiting for the right moment to come out. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands were no longer tense. Even her posture had changed slightly, more relaxed, more grounded. She was not trying to prove anything, not to anyone else and not even to herself anymore. That pressure had slowly faded away without her noticing. And that was when something important began to form inside her music. A sense of confidence. Not loud confidence, Not the kind that demands attention, but a quiet confidence that simply exists without needing approval. She reached a section of the melody where everything felt balanced. The highs and lows of the music were no longer extreme. They were connected, flowing into each other smoothly. It felt complete in a way she could not fully understand. She paused briefly again, letting the last note hang in the air. The sound slowly faded into silence, but the feeling did not disappear. It stayed. She sat still for a moment, her hands resting gently on her lap. The hall around her was quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. This silence felt full, almost like it was holding the memory of what had just been created. She looked down at her hands. They looked the same as always. Simple, ordinary hands. But now they felt different to her, like they had learned something important without words. She took a slow breath and leaned slightly back from the piano. For the first time, she did not feel like someone who had been rejected. She did not feel like someone who was not enough. She felt like someone who had created something real, even if no one else had seen it. And that feeling stayed with her. She slowly stood up from the bench and looked around the empty hall once more. The space was still old, still quiet, still forgotten by most of the world. But in her eyes it no longer felt empty. Felt like a beginning. She stood for a moment in the empty hall, looking at the old piano as if it had become something more than just an instrument. The silence around her felt different now. It was no longer heavy or empty. It felt calm, almost warm, like it was quietly holding everything she had just expressed. Her fingers were still slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity of what she had just experienced. She had played before many times alone, but something about this time felt deeper. It was not just practice or emotion. It felt like she had reached a place inside herself that she had never touched before. She slowly stepped back from the piano. Her eyes moved around the hall once again. The broken window, the dust in the corners, the worn-out chairs lined up quietly along the wall. Everything was the same as before. Yet, in her mind, it all looked different now. It no longer felt like a forgotten place. It felt like a place that had listened. She gently placed her hand on the side of the piano, almost like a quiet thank you that did not need words. Then she turned slightly, standing still for a moment, as if she was trying to hold onto the feeling before it faded. But life outside was still waiting. She walked toward the door slowly. Each step felt lighter than before, not because her problems were gone, but because something inside her had changed in the way she carried them. When she stepped outside, the air felt fresh against her face. The world was moving as usual. People passing by, distant sounds of traffic, everyday life continuing without pause. No one around her knew what had just happened inside that quiet hall. And that was fine. For the first time, she did not feel the need for anyone to know. She walked down the street with a calm expression, her thoughts steady but deep. The rejection she had faced before still existed in her memory, but it no longer had the same power over her. It felt like a chapter that had already been read, not something she was still trapped inside. Instead, her mind kept returning to the music, not as something she had done, but as something she had discovered. It was strange for her. She had not followed instructions, she had not performed for anyone, and she had not tried to meet expectations. Yet what had come out of her was something she could not ignore anymore. Felt real. And that reality stayed with her throughout the day. Even while doing her usual work, her mind drifted back to the sound she had created. Not every second, but in quiet moments. Like when her hands were free or when she paused between tasks, she would suddenly remember the feeling of the keys under her fingers and the way the notes had flowed without force. She did not talk about it to anyone. She had never been someone who easily shared her inner thoughts. And this was something too personal to explain in simple words. But something was changing in her. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was slow and steady, like a small light growing inside her that no one else could see yet. Later that day, while walking back home, she passed near a small gathering area where a few people were talking about a music event happening in the city. She did not stop at first. She was about to continue walking as usual, but something made her slow down. The conversation she overheard mentioned the same world she had briefly stepped into before. A world of performers, evaluations, and strict judgment. A world where only trained and polished talent was usually accepted. She remembered that moment clearly. The cold room, the quiet tension, the feeling of being seen but not truly heard. For a second, she almost walked away without thinking more about it. She told herself she did not belong in that kind of place, that she had already experienced what it felt like to be dismissed. But then something else came into her mind. Not the rejection, the music, the sound she had created alone in the hall. That memory felt stronger than the painful one. She stopped walking for a moment. People passed by her without noticing. The conversation around her continued. Life did not pause for her thoughts. But she stood still, caught between what she believed about herself and what she had just discovered. For the first time, she did not immediately reject the idea in her mind. Instead, she asked herself a quiet question. What if that moment in the hall meant something more than just personal expression? She did not answer it right away. She continued walking home, but the question stayed with her. That night, she sat quietly near her small window. The outside world was dim and calm. Lights from distant homes flickered softly. Everything felt peaceful, but her mind was not fully resting. She kept thinking about the piano, not as a memory of playing, but as a feeling she could still hear inside her. She tried to understand what had changed. She had been the same person before entering that hall. She still had no formal training, no recognition, no clear path in music. But something inside her had shifted. It was not about becoming someone else. It was about realizing something that had been there all along. Her connection with music was not something she had to earn. It was something she had already been living without fully understanding it. As she sat there, she gently placed her hand on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. In that silence, she could almost hear it again. The flow of notes, the rise and fall of emotion, the way silence itself had become part of the music. She opened her eyes slowly. There was no sudden decision, no dramatic promise to change everything overnight. But there was a quiet understanding forming inside her. She could not ignore what she had felt, even if the world had not heard her yet. The next morning came, and life continued as usual. But she was not entirely the same. She still walked the same streets, still did her work, still spoke very little. But her thoughts had changed direction. They were no longer only about survival and routine. Now, there was something else quietly living alongside them. Possibility, not certainty, not success, just possibility. And that was enough to keep her moving differently. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she would return to that world again, or if she would ever be heard by anyone beyond that empty hall. But for the first time, she was no longer afraid of the question. Because somewhere deep inside her, she had already begun to understand something important. Her voice, even if still unseen, had already started speaking.